Shay Donnelly tore open the letter standing right there at the Merino post office counter, boots still crusted with 3 days of trail dust, and read the first line twice before he understood he was holding something that was never meant for him at all. "Dear Sir," the letter began, in a careful, looping hand. "I write in answer to your notice in the Territorial Gazette, though I confess I have rewritten this page 4 times and burned the first 3, for I find it a strange thing to introduce myself to a stranger on paper and ask him to consider marrying me." Shay looked up at Abel Crenshaw, the postmaster, who was squinting at a ledger through spectacles perched crooked on his nose. "Mr. Crenshaw, this here letter's addressed to Box 12. I'm Box 21. Box 1221. Numbers all look the same to me by 4 o'clock, son," Crenshaw said, not looking up. "You want I should take it back?" Shay meant to say yes. He meant to hand the letter back across the counter and let it find its rightful owner. Whoever held Box 12, whoever had placed a notice in the Gazette seeking a wife and was, presumably, a more settled and respectable man than a line rider who owned little more than a horse, a saddle, and a growing pile of unspent wages. But his eyes had already dropped back to the page, to the widow who confessed to burning 3 drafts before she found the courage to write a 4th, and something in her plain honesty held him where he stood. "I am a widow of 1 year," the letter went on. "My husband left me a small printing shop here in Merino, and a debt I did not know we carried until the bank's notice arrived. I do not write to you out of romance, sir, though I would not be honest if I said I had given up hoping for it somewhere along the way. I write because I am tired of being brave alone, and your notice said you wanted a sensible, capable wife, and I am those things, whatever else I am not. I would like to know you, if you are willing to be known." Shay folded the letter back into its envelope and rode for the lantry spread with it tucked inside his coat. And it was Gus, riding beside him that same evening, who finally admitted where the confusion had started in the first place. "I might have put your name down in the Gazette's bachelor notices back in the spring," Gus said, studying the road ahead of his horse's ears with great interest. "On account of you were out on the roundup and couldn't tell me not to, and it seemed a fair joke at the time, seeing as you're always going on about how you mean to have your own place and never once about a wife to keep it with. I figured nothing would come of it. Notices like that mostly don't." "Well, something's come of it," Shay said, and pulled the letter from his coat, and read Gus enough of it that even Gus, who did not embarrass easy, went quiet a while, listening to a widow's careful, unhappy honesty read aloud on a dusty road at dusk. "You aiming to write her back?" Gus asked eventually. "I'm aiming to tell her the truth of it first," Shay said, "and let her decide from there what she wants done. Seems the least a man owes a woman who wrote something that honest, not to answer her, with a lie of omission on top of the post office's mistake." Naomi Caro had written that letter at her kitchen table 2 nights running, by the light of a lamp she was rationing oil for, and had walked it to the post office herself rather than trust it to anyone else, because a woman did not get many chances to say a true thing to a stranger, and she meant this one to count. She had answered Barnaby Coswell's notice in the Gazette with her eyes open. He was the richest merchant in the county, a man who wanted, by his own admission, a wife who could keep his books and his house in good order and did not require pretty speeches to be content. It was not the marriage she had once dreamed of as a girl. But dreams did not pay a note the bank meant to call in 60 days' time, and Naomi had learned since Daniel died that a woman who waited for the marriage she'd dreamed of generally ended up with neither the dream nor the roof over her head. She had not expected an answer within the week. She certainly had not expected the answer she got. "Dear Mrs. Caro," the reply began, in a plain, unhurried hand that slanted a little to the left. I ought to tell you straight off that I don't believe I'm the man your letter was meant for, on account of I never placed any notice in the Gazette that I know of, though my bunkmate Gus allowed afterward he'd entered my name in the bachelor's column as a joke while I was out on the spring roundup, and never told me until your letter turned up in my box by some mix-up of the post. I've turned this over 3 days now trying to decide whether to send your letter along to whoever it was truly meant for, or write back myself and own up to the mistake and see what you thought of that. I'm not a rich man, ma'am. I ride for the Lantry outfit outside town, and what I've got saved wouldn't buy the roof you're standing under, let alone save it. But I read your letter through twice, and I did not find one word in it that sounded like a woman looking for an easy bargain, and I have found, in my experience, that a person who can be that honest to a stranger on paper is worth knowing regardless of what she thinks she's writing to find. If you'd rather I forward this along to the right man's box, I'll do it and think no less of you for asking. But if you'd care to write back to the wrong man instead, I'd count myself glad of it. Naomi read that letter standing in her own doorway with the autumn wind pulling at her skirts, and found herself laughing, an unfamiliar, rusty sound, because she had not laughed much since Daniel's funeral, at the plain foolishness of it. A bachelor entered into a matrimonial notice by his own bunkhouse friend without his knowledge, and a widow's careful, hard-won honesty landing in his lap instead of the wealthy merchants she'd aimed it at. She told herself she ought to write to Mr. Coswell directly and settle the matter properly. She told herself that for 3 days, in fact, while she answered Shay Donnelly's letter instead, because his had made her laugh, and she found she did not want to give that up so quickly. She had buried Daniel a year before in the small cemetery behind the Merino church, after a wagon accident on the Cross Timbers Road had taken him quick and left her with a printing press, a stack of unpaid supplier bills, and a town full of neighbors who were kind to her face and doubtful behind her back. A woman running a press alone was, in the opinion of most of Merino, a temporary arrangement, a placeholder until some sensible man stepped in to either marry her or buy the shop out from under her for a fair price, and a great deal of relief on everyone's part. She had set her jaw against that opinion for a year, setting type with ink-blackened fingers late into the night, selling advertisements to the mercantile and the feed store and the 2 competing churches, and had very nearly kept the note current on her own, until the bank, new ownership since old Mr. Purdy's retirement, decided a widow's signature alone was insufficient security, and called the balance due entire, 60 days hence, unless she could show some more permanent arrangement for the shop's future. It was that letter from the bank, arriving the same week as the Gazette's notice from Barnaby Coswell, that had decided her. She was not a romantic girl anymore, whatever she had been at 19 when she married Daniel for love and nothing else. She was a woman with a debt and a press, and no illusions left about what the world owed a widow who wanted to keep both. She did not tell Shay in that first reply that she still believed some tangle of the post must connect him to the original notice. That in her mind, not knowing any better, the plain-spoken cowboy signing his letters * Shay, and the wealthy merchant who'd placed the Gazette notice, were somehow one, and the same confusion sorting itself out, rather than 2 entirely separate men. It did not occur to her that Barnaby Coswell, waiting in his fine house on Merino's only paved street, had received no reply at all to his own notice, and was growing daily more irritated about it. Certain some rival must have gotten to the widow first. They wrote for 6 weeks. Shay told her about the Lantry spread, and the ornery gray gelding he was gentling on his own time in hopes of buying it off old Cyrus Lantry come spring, and about his mother, gone 8 years now, who had taught him his letters at a kitchen table not so different. he imagined, from the one she wrote from. He told her, too, about the bunkhouse teasing that followed once Gus's confession got around, the other hands ribbing him something fierce about corresponding with a widow under a false name. Though none of them teased very long once they saw how carefully he answered her letters of an evening, hunched over the bunkhouse table by lamplight long after the others had turned in, crossing out whole lines and starting fresh, rather than send her anything less than the truth. Naomi told him about the printing shop, the smell of ink that never quite left her hands, the weekly paper Daniel had built from nothing, and that she was determined not to let the bank take from her out of nothing more than a woman's supposed incapacity to run it alone. She told him about Mrs. Iverson from the mercantile, who came by twice a month to suggest, gently and repeatedly, that Naomi might do better to sell the press and take in sewing instead, since sewing was a trade nobody thought unseemly for a woman alone. She did not tell him, at first, about the 60 days ticking down on the bank's note. She was ashamed of needing rescue. But somewhere in the 5th week she found she trusted his plain hand enough to tell him anyway, and his answer came back within days, careful and unpromising of money he did not have, offering instead every evening after chores that he could spare to help her however a strong back and a willing pair of hands might be of use. And true to his word, he began riding in twice a week after supper to split kindling and mend the shop's sagging back step, refusing every time she tried to pay him, saying only that a man ought to be able to do a kindness for a friend without it turning into a transaction. It was on one of those evenings, sitting on the mended step with the ink and wood smoke smell of her small kitchen behind them, that Naomi first let herself wonder whether what she felt reading his letters and what she felt sitting beside him in the actual dark were, after all, the very same thing, and whether she had been foolish to think a woman could tell the difference between gratitude and love when both arrived, in her case, wearing the same worn coat. She very nearly talked herself out of it twice more before the truth of the letters came unraveled. Once, in the 4th week, when the bank's clerk stopped by the shop to remind her, with an apologetic little cough, that 51 days remained on the note, and she sat down that same night to write Shay a letter breaking things off before they had properly begun, reasoning coldly that a woman with a debt could not afford to let herself want a man who could not help pay it. She got as far as, "Dear Shay, I have thought this over carefully these long, sleepless nights, and believe it best," before she stopped, read the words back to herself in the lamplight, and put the pen down, because she found she did not believe a single one of them. And Naomi Caro had promised herself, answering that first Gazette notice, that she would not spend the rest of her life writing things she did not believe simply because they were sensible. She tore the page in half and wrote him about the weather instead, and about a stubborn press roller that had jammed twice that week, and felt lighter for the cowardice of it. The second time was harder to talk herself out of, because it came not from her own doubt but from the town's, delivered plainly by her own sister-in-law, Daniel's sister Ruth, who wrote from Cross Timbers to say she had heard, through channels Naomi did not care to trace, that the widow Caro was keeping company with a common cowhand, while a respectable, wealthy man's offer sat waiting, and that Daniel, God rest him, would surely have wanted better sense shown with the shop he'd built. Naomi cried over that letter longer than she liked to admit, not because Ruth was right, but because some small, tired, frightened part of her was afraid that she might be. It was Gus, in the end, needled by his own guilty conscience, who let slip to half the bunkhouse that Shay Donnelly had been corresponding for 2 months with a widow who believed she was writing to Barnaby Coswell, and the story traveled from the bunkhouse to the saloon to the mercantile counter, inside of a single Sunday, as such stories will in a town the size of Marino. Coswell heard it from his own clerk, purple with fury that a line rider had been intercepting correspondence meant for him, and rode straight for the post office demanding Crenshaw explain how a letter addressed to Box 12 had ended up delivered to Box 21. "Numbers," Crenshaw said miserably, "do have a way of turning themselves around on a tired man, Mr. Coswell. I'm awful sorry for it." "Sorry does not undo 2 months," Coswell snapped, and rode next for Naomi's print shop, where he informed her, standing stiff and affronted amid the ink-smelling clutter of her press, that she had been carrying on an improper correspondence under his name through no fault of her own, that the mistake would be corrected at once, and that he expected her, as the woman who had answered his notice in good faith, to honor the arrangement she had originally intended with him, as was only proper, and not with a hired hand who owned nothing but a horse and a debt of his own besides. Naomi stood very still amid her own machinery, ink on her fingers and her heart going hard in her chest, and understood for the first time in 2 months what a fool's tangle she had let herself walk into without ever meaning to. "I did not know," she said. "I believed the whole while I was writing to the man who placed the notice. I would have written to correct it the moment I understood, Mr. Coswell, had anyone thought to tell me." "Then you'll write to correct it now," Coswell said, "and honor the arrangement, and I'll settle your note at the bank myself as a wedding gift, and this whole embarrassing business need never be spoken of in Merino again." It was, she would think later, exactly the offer she had gone looking for 2 months before: security, a settled note, a roof kept over her head, all for the price of a marriage she did not have to hope for love in. She had wanted precisely that once. She found, standing in her ink-stained apron with Barnaby Coswell's cold, correct offer hanging in the air, that she could no longer make herself want it now. "I'll think on it," was all she said, because she did not yet trust her own voice to say the rest, and Coswell, taking that for encouragement, rode off satisfied that the matter was as good as settled. Mrs. Iverson was in the shop within the hour, of course, drawn by the sight of Coswell's fine buggy parked out front, and by supper the whole of Merino had heard some version of the story. The widow Caro, caught out corresponding under a false name with a hired hand, offered a graceful way clear of her own foolishness by the county's most eligible bachelor. Most of the town's opinion, delivered to Naomi in small doses over the counter and across the fence line for the next 2 days, ran heavily in favor of the sensible course. A woman with a debt and a press to run could hardly afford the luxury of a cowhand's uncertain wages, whatever her heart had gotten tangled up in over 2 months of letters. Naomi listened to all of it, nodded where nodding seemed to cost her nothing, and said not one word about what she actually intended, because she was no longer entirely sure herself, and a woman did not owe the whole town her uncertainty on top of everything else it already felt entitled to. She wrote to Shay that same night and told him everything: Coswell's visit, the offer of the note settled, the town already murmuring that the sensible course for a widow with a failing shop was obvious, and she'd be a fool to refuse it. She did not ask him to talk her out of it. She was not sure, writing it, what she wanted him to say back at all. Shay rode into Merino himself the next morning, earlier than his usual visits, dust still on him from a night spent close herding a nervous bunch of cattle against a building storm, and found her on the boardwalk outside her own shop before she had finished reading his reply twice through. "I came to say it plain instead of trusting the mail with it," he said, hat in his hands, looking younger and more unsettled than his careful letters had ever let on. "I can't match Coswell's offer, Naomi. I've got maybe $80 saved, and a half-broke gray gelding, and a job that could end with a bad season same as anybody's. I've got no house of my own to bring you to yet, only a bunkhouse cot and a promise I mean to keep working toward something better. If you take his offer, I'll not think one bad thing of you for it, because a woman's got a right to choose her own safety, and I know what these 2 months have cost you in worry that I couldn't fix with a letter. But I came to tell you, before you decided anything, that whatever the post office mixed up between us, I don't believe for 1 minute it was a mistake that I fell in love with your letters, or with you, once I'd read enough of them to know you. I'd rather you chose me poor and certain than him rich and sorry. Yes. Naomi opened her mouth to answer him, and never got the chance, because that was the moment the storm that had been building all morning broke loose over Marino at once. The sky, which had sat low and yellow-gray since dawn, split open in a single hard crack of lightning close enough to raise the hair on both their arms, and for a moment the whole street held its breath, market-goers glancing up at the sudden violent light before returning, uneasy, to their stalls and their business. Then from somewhere past the schoolhouse, a low rolling rumble rose up that Naomi mistook for one merciful heartbeat, for thunder rolling on behind the lightning. It was not thunder. It was the Lantry herd, penned that morning at the edge of town awaiting the noon cattle car, spooked loose and tire at the crack of the sky, and now stampeding blind and terrified straight down the open lane toward the town square, where half of Marino stood gathered with baskets and market carts and Saturday's whole slow business, utterly unaware of what was bearing down on them. Shay was already moving before Naomi had finished understanding what the sound meant, swinging up onto his gray, gelding bareback with nothing but a rope halter, shouting for the market crowd to clear the lane. Naomi, instead of running for shelter as every sensible instinct told her to, turned and ran the other way, back into her own shop, because the ledger books recording Daniel's press and every subscriber account that stood between her and the bank were stacked on the front counter where she'd left them that morning, and she could not lose them to trampled wreckage on top of everything else she'd already lost. She had the ledgers gathered in her arms and had just reached the door again when the first of the herd came around the corner of the feed store, wild-eyed and unstoppable, close enough that she felt the ground shake up through her own boots. She had time only to freeze, ledgers clutched to her chest, before Shay came alongside at a dead run on the gray, leaned low from the saddle, and caught her up bodily off the boardwalk and across his own lap in a single motion that knocked the breath clean out of her, driving the gelding hard sideways into the mouth of the alley beside her shop, a bare instant before the herd thundered past the very spot where she'd stood. They came to rest shaking, both of them, in the narrow safety of the alley, the herd's dust still rolling past the mouth of it, Naomi's ledgers scattered in the dirt where she dropped them without noticing, her arms locked around Shay's neck, and his arm locked hard around her waist, as though neither of them had yet decided it was safe to let go. "You fool woman," Shay said, hoarse, running back in for ledger books with the whole Lantry herd bearing down on you. "You fool man," Naomi answered, just as hoarse, riding bareback into a stampede on a half-broke horse to fetch me out of it. They looked at each other, and both began, unsteadily, to laugh, the particular helpless laughter of two people who have just discovered they are alive and unhurt, and holding onto exactly the person they wanted to be holding onto. By the time the Lantry hands had the herd turned and quieted a quarter-mile past the schoolhouse, half of Marino had gathered at the mouth of the alley to see the widow Caro set down gently from a cowhand's saddle, her ledgers gathered up and returned to her by the very hands that had swept her clear of danger. And there was not a soul among them, not even Barnaby Coswell arriving late and dust-covered from the far side of the square, who could mistake what they were looking at for anything but a woman who had already made up her mind. Coswell, to his credit, did not make a scene of it. He stood at the edge of the gathered crowd a long moment, watching Naomi laugh again, unsteady and radiant, in the arms of a cowhand who owned $80 and a half-broke horse, and something in his stiff, transactional face eased into what might almost have been rueful respect. "It seems, Mrs. Caro," he said, when the crowd had begun to thin, "that the post office did us both a kindness in its clumsiness, whatever trouble it caused along the way. I'll not press my offer further, but I find myself in need of a reliable printer for the county's business notices. If you'd still take on Coswell Mercantile's account once you're through being terrified half to death." It was, Naomi realized, the nearest thing to an apology and a peace offering a man like Coswell knew how to make, and she accepted the account gladly the following week, which did more to settle her note at the bank than his original cold offer of marriage ever could have. Once the Territorial Gazette got wind of the whole story, the switched letters, the stampede, the widow snatched from under a herd's hooves by the very cowhand she'd fallen for by pure clerical accident, and ran it as a feature the whole county talked about for a month, sending subscribers to Naomi's little weekly paper in numbers Daniel himself had never seen in his best year. Even Mrs. Iverson, who had spent 2 solid days advising Naomi toward the sensible course, showed up at the shop counter within the week to order a dozen extra copies of the Gazette feature to send to her sister in the next county, allowing that she supposed a woman knew her own heart better than her neighbors generally gave her credit for, which was as close to an apology as Marino's opinion was ever likely to offer. Shay Donnelly bought the gray gelding off Cyrus Lantry that spring with wages saved, and a small bonus Lantry insisted on paying him for keeping half the herd from trampling his own market square. And by summer, he had bought, too, 4 acres adjoining Naomi's shop with a view to building a house there come autumn, close enough that she never had to give up the press her husband had left her, nor the ink-stained hands that came with running it. They were married in June, in the shade of the same schoolhouse the herd had so nearly reached, with Abel Crenshaw standing near the back looking sheepish and pleased in equal measure. And when the preacher asked if anyone present knew a reason the two should not be joined, Gus called out from the second row that he supposed he ought to confess to arranging the whole thing, which he had certainly never meant seriously, and the whole church dissolved into the kind of laughter that follows a couple into a marriage like a blessing. Even Ruth made the trip from Cross Timbers for it, standing stiffly through the ceremony but weeping, unmistakably, when Shay slid a plain gold band onto Naomi's ink-stained finger. And afterward she admitted to Naomi, quietly, over cake, that she had judged a man's worth by his wages once and would try, from that day forward, to know better than to make that mistake again. Abel Crenshaw, for his part, took to double-checking every box number twice after that, muttering under his breath as he sorted, and swore for the rest of his working life that he had never in 40 years made another mistake half so consequential, though he did allow, to anyone who asked, that he wasn't sure he'd ever apologize for that particular one. Naomi kept, framed above the press in her shop, the first letter Shay had ever sent her, the one addressed to a stranger's box by pure mistake, admitting he wasn't the man she thought she was writing to and asking anyway whether she'd care to know him, because she had come to believe, turning it over in the years that followed, that the post office had never truly gotten anything wrong at all. It had only delivered her, by the crooked, unlikely road such things sometimes traveled, exactly to the man she was always meant to find. And on quiet evenings, with the press finally still and Shay's boots sounding on the porch he'd built with his own hands, she would sometimes take that letter down and read it again, not because she had forgotten a single word of it, but because some kinds of luck deserved to be turned over more than once, held up to the lamp, and thanked.